My name is Luke Montgomery. I'm the Chief Examiner at the Special Forces Experience, and I'm joining this Summit mini course to talk a little bit about critical thinking in the current context of this day and age, and culture as narrative. So some of this stuff is not so new, and a little bit of it is inspired by newer, more contemporary philosophies that I think are super relevant in the current context with all that's going on. And even if things were different and circumstances were different, then I think it's timelessly valuable. So we're going to go through different steps of it. And there's a bit of a summary to begin with of surviving, thriving, and a bit of a call to action. And all that will become a little bit more clear as we go on. So if we could start with surviving with critical thinking and culture's narrative. It's a little different from some of the other topics you see in this course. There's making your own shelter, collecting food, foraging, surviving in the physical sense. And this will be a little bit of a different context. But I guess I would start with noting that, we live in a world populated by, over 7.5 billion human beings, many of whom are seemingly at odds with each other in some way, shape, or form. There's some conflict. Part of that's timeless, and part of it's really specific to the current context and the current circumstances. Surviving via critical thinking and understanding culture as narrative is about preserving a sense of individual power in a modern world that may or may not want to control you and your thoughts in a certain way. And about embracing community and love via constructive conversation amid some of the most complex issues we've ever had to face. So in a nutshell, thinking is good. Good thinking makes for good talking, which makes for good solving. Moving on to thriving. The more authentic we are as individuals, the more genuine and enduring our success will be as a species and global community. And this doesn't mean, of course, we all need to agree always on all things. Nor does it mean I or we are telling you how to think, feel, or act, but rather free yourself from the constraints of your cultural bias so you can contribute your own kind of clear thoughts. And this is going to touch upon a topic I'll further develop in a bit called Mother Nature versus Mother Culture. So I kind of extrapolate on that analogy of defining culture, what exactly culture is in the framework of how we view nature and the complexity of all that. But more on this later. So culture, the word culture may conjure thoughts in your mind of food, music, different ways of speaking, languages, dialects, accents, but it's so much more than that. And it's virtually everything you see outside of nature. And we'll talk a little bit more of that in the last part of this. And to sum up a call to action, which I'll reiterate at the end, I should mention this notion of mother culture, among other ideas I'm talking about, are really in a way inspired by the works of a writer named Daniel Quinn. And so I'd love to highly recommend reading his works, specifically the Ishmael series. So Ishmael, My Ishmael, and Beyond Civilization, Humanity's Next Great Adventure. This will kind of break down the philosophical topic behind how we're looking at culture and how that shapes kind of our own narratives and opinions and thoughts and ideas, tackling problems and so on. Beyond that, the Trials course, which you can find at wayoftrials.com, is also a great opportunity to learn more about these cognitive tools to navigate the modern world. And as a call to action, I would say, in a gist, begin to look at your culture and its narrative more closely, and start to separate yourself so you can contribute more on a genuine level. And I'll move into that more as we move along, what that means. So where I'll start really is with critical thinking. And thinking critically in the modern world, it may conjure up some ideas. You may have studied it in school, or we might have one way to look at what critical thinking really is. But sometimes when people hear the word critical or critically, it conjures up ideas of being negative or a kind of a down the dumps kind of person. So thinking critically does not necessarily mean cynically. They sometimes are confused or overlapped in a lot of ways, cynical and critical. So I'll dive into the origins actually of the word cynicism. For cynics in philosophy, as old as it is, thousands of years, it essentially meant the purpose was to live life in virtue and in agreement with nature. So it really didn't have anything to do with being negative. So agreement with nature, what does that mean? Basically means if you are cynical and or thinking critical and engaging in that side of your brain, you are distancing yourself from the human introduced topics and ideas and material things in the world so that you can kind of come at it from an organic point of view, kind of decide things, make judgments of your own that are more wholesome and maybe not guided by a hand, a political body, or a celebrity's idea. So it can be really tricky about, the process can be really tricky in forming your own opinion. That's really, really yours. And the world needs that, right? It needs personal opinion. It needs your ideas. So I think the whole embracing of this idea of mother culture and the global community is about finding that community of real, authentic, personal ideas so that we don't have one person being depended upon for, great innovation or solidarity in community. The way I'll put this now is really, it's about autonomy and truth in one's thought processes. So one might say in conversation, well, that's just my opinion. But I would ask, is it really? And how much of it is yours? So I'm here to suggest otherwise and the possibility of otherwise, that opinion may not be wholly yours. It's kind of drawn upon by different inspirations and different people that we're following or hearing from, and they kind of find their way into our subconscious and start kind of making our conversations and our problem-solving processes a little messy. So having autonomy in one's thought processing is about your consumption rate of others through social media, television, pop songs, you name it, versus production of your own kind of judgment, your own organic judgment process. So I think a great way to start piecing that apart is when you are consuming versus producing, which is a nice balance as well, right? I'm not saying to totally forgo all consumption or listening to other people, but a helpful approach to that is to learn about logical fallacies. And I'm sure that's something that a lot of you have heard about, logical fallacy. But I'm just going to walk through the most common of them, the most prominent. And really, in my going over this, it's all about spotting them in conversation, identifying them, pointing them out in a polite way or in a constructive way, and working to navigate around them in a group discussion or a one-on-one discussion. So while I think all these tactics are used frequently by the day, hour, minute, I'll point out a few, again, that I think are the most common right now or particularly dangerous in the current global context. Ad hominem. Rather than refuting someone's argument, that person attacks the individual personally instead. As in, of course you'd say that because you support so-and-so. Political correctness. Essentially a form of language control, this one used to be called the name-calling fallacy, but can be defined in the current context as changing the nature of something by giving it another name. As in, I'm not poor, I'm economically disadvantaged. This is one that I've marked as particularly relevant in the current context, and I'm sure that lots of you can see why. Appeal to authority. Another one that's particularly important in the current context is about stating that whatever is claimed is true because a so-called authority said so, instead of applying reason or further level of understanding. As in, this decision is so obviously in the best interest of our economy because the Prime Minister or President said so. The straw man, arguing against a phony, weak, or ridiculous position that you have created and then proceed to easily knock down. As in, tree-hugging spiritual people aren't rational because they focus on things that don't exist. Appeal to ignorance, using the premise that since we do not know or cannot prove something, then it must be either false or true. As in, I don't see any evidence that climate change is real, so it must be a hoax. The false dilemma, reducing an argument down to only two options despite the fact that there may be many more and far better possibilities to choose from. As in, you're either with us or against us. The slippery slope, which is another one I've chosen to mark down as hyper relevant to the current context, is taking an argument from a sensible moderate place and moving it to an extreme place via one thing leads to another kind of route, regardless of reasonable logic. As in, of course I'm right, because if I was wrong, then I wouldn't know anything at all of what I'm talking about, and therefore I would be a useless liar with no credibility whatsoever. Circular argument, repeating what has just been said so as to close the argument loop. As in, of course everyone loves Star Wars because it's great. Alphabet soup. The overuse of acronyms, abbreviations, or specialized language to bamboozle people into believing you know what you're talking about and therefore must be right. As in, it is often the case that someone suffering from DSW2 deficiency in their lymphatic C5X chromosome system will also show a 6% increase in 10q17 regression marked with a surge in B5232C plasma filament growth. Bandwagon. Another one that is very common these days, probably because there are so many people in the world, among many other reasons, is about using the premise that something is correct, good, true, right, or whatever the heck you want it to be simply because most people think so as well. As in, lots of people eat fast food, so it must not be that bad for you. And lastly, and perhaps most famously, the red herring. Using a clever but irrelevant argument to distract from the real topic of discussion. As in, why do we need to raise taxes to this exact amount? Well, because schools need funding and children represent the future, and we must support them 100%. Next up, I'm going to go into all this is kind of building towards word choice, the importance of word choice in conversation, in your own thoughts, and in consuming media. So when you're analyzing or kind of appreciating someone's approach through, whether it be through a popular song or through a lecture you like, or a speaker or a speech, or even in just a conversation personally with someone you know, and your delivery of it yourself. I'm talking about word accuracy. So really taking the time to pick out, not nitpick, but really pick out a really suitable word for the words that you're really trying to express where you're coming from accurately. Use of hyperbole, so extreme words. I think in this day and age, it's really common to exaggerate our thoughts a little bit. So think about, the dangers of using too extreme of a word. Think of that spectrum, this is really bad, this is really good. You're kind of coming at it with a reasonable angle. So not to say never use extreme words, but just choose them carefully. And the context of your word choice. So think about the current context. So if we're evaluating one topic in the sprawling all of time, right? You don't want to look at one word or conversation or topic the same way in all contexts. They change sometimes. And we'll go through some examples again. So essentially, words form the worlds of our thoughts. Our problems and our solutions. And And while not all things can be perfectly captured in words, our emotions, our thoughts are so complex at times, and it's seemingly as sprawling as the English language and so many other languages are. They can't do it justice a lot of the time, especially when we're feeling a lot about what we're trying to communicate to others. And especially if a conversation or debate gets a little heated, it's tough to really capture it all. But trying to use accurate wordage and agreed upon words is at the root of what it means to be a team in the modern age, especially perhaps. And to be in this together, as we like to say, and to, you see it here and there, you see it in social media, and which is a phenomenal idea, right? But I think that this breaking down of words and thought processes and critical thinking and evaluation of our culture, what are our cultural norms, what are our cultural biases, that is really what it means to be in this together and to think and speak critically together. So now we're moving on to what I introduced initially, this idea, this analogy of mother culture versus mother nature. So I'm using this analogy of mother nature to understand culture as similarly expansive, complex, and interconnected with all that we are and all that we do in society. So outside of the natural world, everything you've been listening to since the day of your birth, essentially. Your parents' worldview, cartoon characters, television, newsletters, newscasters, school teachers, politicians, talk shows, blogs, advertisements, social media, pop songs, lectures, speeches, sermons, jokes, and the list goes on. The culture is sprawling. And one might say under this analogy is sprawling and complex as the natural world that we live in. So this is helpful to understand and study to become more aware of the origins of one's current circumstances. So in the big picture, how did we really get here? How did we get to this issue? How did we get this, how did we get this far, or how do we get stuck in this kind of predicament? And mother culture can be most easily visible day to day when people can have and often have entirely different perspectives on the same topics. And in understanding why, we have further hope to get to the root of that issue with solidarity and a measure of agreement. No matter how idealistic that sounds, I think the more we embrace this critical thinking approach and evaluating our culture, how sprawling it is, how different it is, then we get to the root of that measure of agreement, right? And also kind of produce what I was talking about before in genuine opinion construction. So again, the world needs that now more than ever, probably, with that more than 7.5 billion people in the world. We need real opinions and real thoughts and heartfelt contributions, and not so much cognitive mental factories of leaders or celebrities or whoever we look up to pushing those agendas on us. So the important tool that I wanted to note as you navigate culture and narrative really is, in simple terms, patience. But the real philosophical term to avoid, or the term of the action we want to avoid, is plunging, or moving too fast, thus skipping important details. And this is commonly done by rapidly jumping from one cultural assumption to the next, without honest critical inquiry to really reevaluate whether that notion is real or not. So in conclusion, there's also another sort of term that is helpful to look at ourselves in that ideal scenario. So if we're thinking more critically, using our words more accurately, and forming our own judgments in the world of the big cultural beast, there's such a thing called the maieutic teacher. So these kind of teachers, instead of delivering a sermon or a lecture, are really acting kind of as midwives to the thought processes. And it's under the theory that we all have our own developing stories on our own life narratives, and our own view of the world, which becomes a cultural narrative. And if we act as meiotic teachers and kind of hone out constructive dialogues, we're essentially helping the birth of the ideas out of each other. So in that way, we get highly creative, highly innovative, and miraculous ideas come to fruition. And if you look back over history, that may be the case of often or all of the really great turning points and innovations, with great leaders at least. And ideally this comes down to a grassroots level where, as I said, we act as meiotic teachers for one another in the production of good critical thinking and understanding culture's narrative. So thank you for listening, and if you have any questions at all about any of this, to get to more specific roots of it, you can certainly look up Daniel Quinn's work from the Ishmael series, Ishmael, My Ishmael, and Beyond Civilization. You can find those online or in your local bookstore. And you can also, the Way of Trials course is a great way to build upon these cognitive tools. It definitely dives deep into cultural practices, narrative practices, your own mindset, to kind of become the most authentic self you can be. And lastly, you can follow me or connect with me online through email or Instagram to ask any questions you might have to dive a little deeper into the specifics of all this philosophy. So you can find me on Instagram at Zachariah_Montgomery, or through my Gmail account, the Montgomery Picture at gmail.com. Thanks for listening.